Okay, hello everyone. This is the first sort of bonus lecture. We're going to be talking about the way economics thinks about equality, mostly so that there's just a kind of beefier amount of equity content in the course. I might even do an extra lecture on ethical and philosophical principles around equity for public policy, but I thought this was kind of more important, especially because we're going to talk a little bit about Pareto efficiency, which is a concept that comes a lot in policy analysis, but that is very rarely covered uh, in undergraduate teaching, either in philosophy or political science, or even, I guess, a lot of the time in economics. There's typically a lot more of an emphasis on the kind of technical analysis and not on the normative criteria. Just as a brief kind of preface to these bonus lectures, like these are not accessible. I don't think they're as important as the regular lectures, but they are admissible for your assessments. So anything in here that you think is relevant to your policy challenge area, you should certainly feel free to apply these concepts there. Because these are bonus lectures and I'm just doing them by video recording in my office, they're going to be a bit more casual, maybe a bit slower than the ones that I give in the lecture theatre. And they might also be a fair bit higher level. I guess I'm going to talk about stuff that I find interesting. There'll be a lot of tangents, that sort of thing. This will be more like how I would give PhD supervision or something like that. All right, so let's get into it. Oops, I'm on the wrong screen. All right, so I think this is kind of an accurate summary, I guess, of like what economics and equity is about. As with most things, the comparative advantage of economics is that it formalizes things. It turns them mathematical, it turns them quantitative, it turns them mechanical. And this is true of normative issues as well. So economics has done a lot to make equity issues, normative issues, tractable in a way that analytical philosophy, I think, has struggled with, but then analytical philosophy has often borrowed tools from economics. So it's this idea before economics, we sit around grousing every night about how no one agrees with us about things. What if we mathematize that? And that's basically how a lot of particularly American welfare economics went through the middle half of the 20th century. So a lot of American libertarian inclined economists, James Buchanan, Milton Friedman, these kind of people were very interested in kind of using economic models, mechanical models, to make normative points that were generally in favor of individualism. And a kind of long-standing critique of this literature is that a lot of the things that are critical of individualism, like the community's formation of preferences, are excluded from economic models. So it's not that, so Milton Friedman and stuff would be like, well, the models show that X, like, yeah, but that's because you've assumed away all the stuff that you don't like. Anyway, I think nonetheless, despite these kind of controversies, there is a lot of good value in this way of thinking. So we're going to go over some of the kind of more fundamental contributions of welfare economics. Obviously, this is a huge field. I publish in it fairly regularly, I guess. But yeah, it's enormous. It's been going on for decades, and I'm not going to do any of the mathematical stuff, but that is the core of it. So we're obviously going to be missing a lot of the meaty bits. All right, so a bit of background. Since kind of Paul Samuelson's work in the 30s, economics has generally been welfarist, which is this idea that what's good about a society, or the thing that matters to whether a society is good, is the utility or the preference satisfaction or the well-being of the people in that society. So it's not about whether that society is close to God. It's not about whether that society respects human rights. All that really matters is people's utility, people's well-being, people's happiness, this kind of stuff. And typically speaking, welfarism is also very individualist. So what matters is individual people's welfare, and then we bring them together in some way to create social welfare. And we'll cover that in a couple of slides. In the kind of purest articulation, not purest, the simplest articulation of welfarism, the most pragmatic one would be that the goal of the social planner, so the person who's thinking about how to design public policy, how to do good governance, their goal is to maximize social welfare. So they're not thinking about their own interests, what's good for society, They want to maximize welfare, and in economics, that's preference satisfaction. And one way that we can proxy set preference satisfaction, one way we can get an indication of how much people's preferences are being satisfied, is by how much money they have and how much purchasing power that money has. Because the more purchasing power you have, the more preferences you can satisfy. And obviously, there are a lot of preferences that are not traded in markets. So preferences for love, for example, preferences for care, things like that. Nonetheless, again, this is like a crude approximation, and it works very well in some cases, like healthcare, for example, and obviously doesn't work so well in others. So from this kind of welfare starting point, we get to two very prominent criteria in economic policy analysis, which is efficiency. So how big can we make the collective pie and thereby satisfy how many preferences? And then equity, which is how we split that pie. So it might be the case that in order to get as big a pie as possible, we need to unevenly distribute that pie to some extent. So for example, if you want high productivity people to produce a lot and thereby grow the pie, you're probably going to need to provide them some sort of incentive. And the main incentive is typically to pay them more, but that means that they have more than other people. But if they don't get more than other people no matter what they do, then they have less of an incentive to really work hard, apply that high productivity, and get the big gains for society. So we often have a tension between efficiency and equity. There are often efficiency and equity trade-offs, and I think one of the best quotes in economics from Thomas Sowell is, in public policy, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Another example of this sort of thing is that taxes, which we cover in the next lecture, have a deadweight loss, which means that by taxing a market, some activity in that market is destroyed. It goes elsewhere to avoid that tax, but it wouldn't have gone there unless there was a tax. So there must be some inefficiency associated with intruding or intervening on that market. However, without taxation, we can't do transfers, and without transfers, it's very hard for us to get distributive fairness in our society. By transfers, I mean things like unemployment benefits, pensions, disability support, this kind of stuff, right? For that, we need taxation, but taxation creates inefficiencies. So we immediately have some trade-offs between equity and efficiency. All right, I mentioned social welfare functions earlier, so we have the individual welfares. How do we bring them together? Now, there's no way to do this scientifically, right? And I think this is one of the kind of key points to make here, is that normative stuff is never scientific. As soon as there is a value judgment to be made, we are no longer in the realm of science. And I think too often scientists are very bad at grasping this. And this is true in general of a lot of economists, and a lot of economists do not realize when they are making value judgments. But Paul Samuelson, who was kind of in many ways the founder of neoclassical economics, he really did get this very, very well. He was very explicit about it, and he spent a lot of his career working on these social welfare functions, which are different ways of aggregating individual utilities to take account of particular normative preferences that we might have as a society. So the three most common ways of doing this in analysis is the utilitarian social welfare function, which is where we just add up the utility of people in society and we try to maximize that. Right? Now, you might have a situation where the pharaoh in ancient Egypt has way more than everybody else, but as long as the total utility in that situation is more than the total utility you'd get under other ways of organizing society, the utilitarian social welfare function would say that that's the optimal way of doing it. That is the just way of organizing society. Now, some of you may have done Rawls already in some of your courses. Rawls had this idea that behind the veil of ignorance, when we don't know who we would be in a society, we would want a more equitable society. We would want a society where the worst off person in that society is as well off as they could be. And we can mathematize this premise in what's called the Rawlsian or Maximin social welfare function, which is that we want to maximize the lowest level of utility among all the utilities in society. So U1, U2, UN, these are all people in society up to the nth, the last person in society. We want to maximize the lowest value among all of those utilities. So whatever brings the worst off person the most utility, that's the situation we should go for. There will still be other people who are better off. And then finally, probably the most popular version of the social welfare function in nowadays is the prioritarian social welfare function, where we have the distribution of stuff, resources in society, of utility. The distribution of utility in society, that's a function. So you could think it's a curve, it's a line, and we can apply another curve to it that weights the benefits accruing to certain people. So we can put more of an emphasis on people who are below average, for an example, and try to pursue policies that improve people who are below average and don't put as much weight on benefits to people who are above average, for example. We can do all sorts of very clever, nifty things using prioritarian functions. All right, now a key thing I want to emphasize again is that these are not tools for answering which of these welfare functions is the best way of doing things. They do not provide analytical traction of that sort. What they do provide in terms of analytical traction is a way to represent normative questions. So you can use these social welfare functions to develop pictures, and you can put them side by side and think, well, is this one better or is this one better? And then you've got to turn to your ethical philosophy to figure out which one you think is better. And ultimately, it's going to be a judgment call because, in my opinion, ethics is vibes all the way down. All right. Another key concept from welfare economics is the notion of Pareto efficiency, and especially of Hicks-Cowdor efficiency. I think Hicks-Cowdor efficiency is perhaps the most important ethical principle in all of economic policy analysis, and particularly economic policy decision making. But let's talk about Pareto improvement first, because Hicks-Cowdor will make more sense if we know what a Pareto improvement is. All right, so the idea behind a Pareto improvement is that somebody in society is made better off and nobody is made worse off. And this seems like probably the most uncontroversially ethically good thing that you can find. Pareto improvements are exquisitely rare. They're so hard to find, but they're very uncomplicated. It's hard to think of a reason why you wouldn't want a Pareto improvement. And so they're a good baseline. So if we can find things that don't cause Pareto violations, then that's really cool. And then we can also use Pareto as a way to establish a simple model of what's good, and then we can look at how far things depart from Pareto optimality and what kind of benefits we get in exchange for that departure. A strong fixation on Pareto improvement will basically lock you out of doing any redistribution, because in redistribution, inevitably somebody is made worse off, but maybe many other people are made better off, right? If we want to take a bunch of money from Elon Musk and give it to poorer people, Elon Musk will be made worse off by that, but a lot of those poor people will be made better off, for example, right? So if we respect Pareto, we'll never get redistribution. The way Hicks-Cowdor works is a bit different. It's sometimes called a potential Pareto improvement. And the idea behind a potential Pareto improvement is that, I'm going to get my laser pointer out, is that winners from a policy change can compensate the losers and be better off on net. So say I get 10 from a policy change and 5 other people lose 1. At this point, I could give each of them back the 1 that they lost, and I would still have 5 left over. And so in that circumstance, society overall seems to be better off on net. But we want to really think about whether that compensation there actually does happen or not. As a general story, in the 1980s, when we did structural adjustment towards markets globally, but especially in the West, the countries that are today very functional, like Australia, Germany, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, they paid a lot of attention to making sure that that compensation actually happened. And the countries that are really riven with populism, either they didn't do structural adjustment at all, so that would be France, or they didn't really pay much attention to compensation. And the main examples there are the United States and the United Kingdom. All right. So I'll just give you one quick example here from economics of a potential Pareto improvement. One of the most famous ones is trade. So you have a standard market. We'll do the market model in a bit more detail next week, but you can also go on the internet and learn about it in 10 minutes from Marginal Revolution on YouTube. So basic idea, we have the supply of some good, the demand for some good, the market clears here, and consumers get this much and producers get this much. Now, if we open ourselves to trade and the world price for this good is lower than the domestic price, so the domestic price was $5, the world price is only $2.50, right? So we start importing. All of these producers who were only able to turn a profit producing this good when the price was $5 can now no longer turn a profit. So they have to exit the market, and all that producer surplus is lost. So that's a loss to them, a cost to them, right? A harm. But we will also see that the consumers who were purchasing at $5, there's now a whole bunch of other consumers, all of these guys here, who now can purchase the good at 2.5 and get the utility of being able to consume that good. So the quantity of the good that is consumed goes out to 7.5 here from the domestic equilibrium of 5, and the quantity that is supplied domestically falls to 2.5. So this amount here, these are the imports that are coming. Okay, not the square, sorry, just that distance from there to there, that's the import. So consumer surplus has risen really substantially, and we can see that there is a net gain of utility to society of this much, right? So the consumers could compensate the producers for the amount that the producers have lost, and the consumers would still be better off on net. And this is one of the main reasons why economists generally are very in favor of free trade. If you do this for exporting industries, it will go the opposite way. So the consumers will be harmed, but the producers will be benefited. And remember that producers tend to employ workers. All right, a few more concepts from economics concerned with equity. So one idea that's quite important is the notion of market justice. So this is the idea that the person who benefits the most from a thing has the highest willingness to pay for it. And so in a market, people will generally just buy the things that matter most to them, bid up the price, and then will ration these goods quite nicely based on who wants them the most. The problem is that not everyone in a modern contemporary market has the equal capacity to pay, right? So I might really, really like driving fast cars. Like generally I may have been born to do that. It might just be my absolute main intrinsic motivation, my only value in life. I'm really good at it. I love doing it. I absolutely froth it. But unfortunately, I was kind of poor, and I can't really afford fast cars, and I can't really get started in that. Whereas there's some other guy over here who's just made a ton of money on Bitcoin or something, doesn't really understand cars, doesn't really even feel comfortable driving his car fast, but just wants it as a status symbol, and so owns a Lamborghini. And this seems to be an inefficient allocation of that good, that fast car, between these two people because of an inequality in capacity to pay. Another concept that's quite important is the notion of a merit good. This is a good that we think should be distributed on the basis of need, not capacity to pay. Pretty simple idea. So for example, education, healthcare, clean air, these kind of things. Generally anything that we could associate with human rights is usually a merit good, and usually something that we think should just be provided to people rather than requiring them to pay for it. Particularly because if we require people to pay for it, then some people who don't need it very much end up with a lot of it, and people who need it a lot don't end up with it. Insulin is another good example of a merit good. Another important point that I could have talked about graphically using what's called the Edgeworth box, but I won't, is just as a point of fact, something to maybe remember, is that markets do not produce equitable outcomes, only efficient outcomes, but from any initial endowment that might be quite unequal and inefficient. So people start with things that they don't really want. Markets will allow people to trade to an efficient, Pareto efficient situation. So a situation where no further trades can happen, in the sense that no one has an incentive to trade. There's no way to make someone in the system better off without making anybody else worse off through trading. So that would be an efficient situation, but that won't necessarily be an equitable situation because you started with an unequal distribution of goods. So economists will typically want to use lump sum transfers to change the initial endowments and then let people trade. And there's so much content in economic models about that, but in reality, we can basically never do that. So I don't really see the point in how much effort we put into this notion of lump sum transfers, because we don't do lump sum transfers, but they are a pretty good reason for example, having public provision of infrastructure, healthcare, education, these kind of things. You can think of those as lump sum transfers, and also as things that promote equality of opportunity, which we'll talk about in a bit. Okay. Key point to remember is that markets produce efficient outcomes, not equitable outcomes. And I'll repeat that in the lecture next week. All right. Now, in lecture 2, I talked a bit about the difference between relative equity and proportional equity. So whether all people have the same amount, or whether people have been compensated based on how hard they tried, right? So whether you got what you deserve, or whether we all have the same amount. And these are quite compelling concepts for a lot of people, and they're often incompatible. Right? And I find, particularly on the kind of progressive side at the moment, there's a lot of sort of talk about the distinction between equality, where everyone has the same amount, and equity, where people are helped in different ways to get to the same amount. And it's kind of presented like this is just sort of really obvious that what we would want is equity, and that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I think a lot of right-leaning people would say that people should not be treated differently, even if they end up in the same spot. And if someone, and I think a good exploration of this is maybe Ali Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, which is a anthropological exploration of Trump voters in the American South. And most of these people are not well off. I mean, they're not badly off necessarily, but I think a lot of them have reason to claim that they have been mistreated by life, by the government, by other people, all sorts of stuff. But they're trying really hard. They're trying really hard to get ahead, and they're taking personal responsibility, this kind of stuff. And one kind of consistent theme that they say is that we don't get any help, and we look around at all these people that we think are doing the wrong thing, taking drugs, doing crime, etc. And often those people are black, and they are getting helped by all these racial equity policies. And these people, these white Trump voters in the South, feel very aggrieved by this. They feel like this is quite unfair, that they are not being treated the same way as these people are being treated, especially when they feel like they're doing all the responsible, morally appropriate things. So I don't think these things are particularly obvious, and I hope that at the end of this course you have a slightly more sophisticated appreciation for some of these issues. All right. So relative proportional equity. How could we represent these things quantitatively? How can we start to get at them with numbers? Well, one tool that economists have developed that I'm sure you guys will come across at some point in your life is the Gini coefficient. I'm not going to go through the maths of the Gini coefficient. Suffice to say that the way it works is as follows. So on the y-axis, you have cumulative income as a percentage. So it's the total product of society up to 100%. So when you're at this level, that's 50% of the product in society. Along the bottom, you have the population of society. So here there's just 10 people, but we could think of these as deciles. So the bottom 10% of income earners, the bottom 50% of income earners, the top 10% of income earners, etc. Right? And then the basic idea is that if you had a 45-degree line here, everyone would have the same amount or the same equal share of this income percentage. Right? So if you were at 50% of society's income, you come across to here and you see that that corresponds to the top 50% of people. So of the 10 people in this society, 5 of them have 50% of the income, right? So that means they have 10% each. So they've all got exactly an equal share. And from there, we can deduce that the deeper this curve, which is called the Lorenz curve, the more unequal the society is. This society right here is pretty equal. So you can see that person 6 over here, they have about 35% of the income. So the bottom 60% of the population is holding about 35% of the income. Not perfect, but not atrocious either. And the top 10% of people have this amount here, which looks like about 10% of the income. So it's like not too bad, all right? So to find the Gini coefficient, which is a single number, we add this surface area and this surface area, and we divide A by the total size of the triangle, right? So the depth of this curve is going to give you the size of area A, and that's going to determine how unequal your society is. Let's have a look at some global data. So I've got my face in the way here. Let me just move that for a second. All right, so you can see that, okay, let me explain the graph first. So this is pre and post-tax Gini coefficients. So the numbers out here, this is pre-tax and transfer. So that's just how unequal society is after raw economic activity. And then the red bars are post-taxes and transfers. So after we've taken money off rich people, given it to poor people, what is our Gini coefficient? And you can see that there are some really big changes pre and post Gini coefficient. So the United States, notably, is not that high in terms of pre-tax Gini coefficient. Like down here, Poland is quite a bit worse. But the United States does very little to combat the existing inequality, so it ends up still with quite a high post-tax and transfer Gini coefficient. In contrast, my home country, Australia, has really quite a high, or pretty high, pre-tax and transfer Gini coefficient, but we do a lot to combat inequality, so it falls down to still like fairly high at 0.38, but not so bad at all. And then if you go down to the Scandinavian countries and some of the some of the Western European welfare states, you see similarly high levels of tax and transfer Gini coefficient, but much lower after the redistribution. So it's really up here, the United States, Israel, they're not doing much about it, and our friends, the United Kingdom, also not doing so much about it, the neoliberal states. Okay, let me get my face back where it needs to be, and we go to the next slide. So just to very quickly show you what this looks like on the curves. So this is the depth of that A curve for the United States. And the main thing that you want to pay attention to is just how steep this last bit is as you go from the 80th to the 100th percentile. So the steeper that line is, the more the wealth is controlled by the ultra rich. You can see that Portugal, which is about halfway down the rankings, that curve is much less steep. And then when you get to the Netherlands, it's even less steep. So in the US, it starts just above 50% and goes up from there. So looking across to the percentage of income. So, you know, like half the income in America is controlled by the top 20% of people. And a lot of that is the top 0.1%. If we go down to Portugal, then we're getting closer to the 60% mark. And then when we go to the Netherlands, it's above 60%. So less of the wealth is controlled by the top 20% of the income distribution. Right. Now, I would say that the workhorse models of economics, things like the demand and supply model, and then other things that you would commonly do in an undergraduate training in economics, do really quite well with quantitative aspects of relative equity. So things like what we measure in the Gini coefficient. How much stuff do you have relative to me? How much stuff does Bezos have relative to the population of America? I think economics can also deal quite well with qualitative relative equity. So how much do black people have compared to white people? How much do women have compared to men? Things like the gender wage gap. Economics is very good at dealing with that. And they can be very sensitive in the models to proportional equity with some adjustments. What they are kind of bad at least in terms of quantifying and representing mechanically in the way that is so common to economics, is equality of opportunity and social mobility. They tend to also be quite weak on structural inequalities. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to look at in the lecture on perspectives from sociology and psychology about the structural determinants of individual outcomes, economics tends to suck at, and that has a lot to do with the fact that economics practices what's called methodological individualism. So its analysis is always conducted at the individual level, and that makes it quite hard for economics to understand structural things which are happening at the macro, at the aggregate level, at the social level. Key point that I want to make that I don't think is talked about enough, right, is when we're thinking about equity and, America's so unequal, what should we do about it? We start talking about taxes and things like that. What we often miss is whether the people who are rich in society are rich because they produce things that we want. J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, she's got a lot of money, right? But it's because she wrote a book that a lot of people like and they bought it. We don't really think Taylor Swift is like a horrible person because she has heaps of money, because people want to listen to her music and they want to pay her for that music. These kind of productive rich people are very different from rent seekers, unproductive rich people, parasites. And in a lot of cases, a lot of rich people are parasites. And this is really harmful to society because these people aren't generating useful things, they're just sucking money out. So what we want to observe is not so much the rich and fighting the rich and the non-rich. We want to instead observe who are these predators, cronies, rent seekers, parasites, and they exist across the income distribution, but I would say they are particularly prominent near the top. Let's look at some examples of rent seeking. So historically, classically, the main rent seekers were landlords, particularly aristocrats in the feudal period, who did nothing. The peasants worked the land, and then they collected huge wealth off the back of that. But you can see this sort of thing even alive and well today when we just look at real estate markets. So this idea here from Boris Johnson considering 50-year mortgages that children can inherit, this is basically a way for a bank to put a little bloodsucker into you and have it stay on for your entire life, where you're just transferring a bunch of interest payments to the bank, barely able to pull down the principal value of your loan while making those interest repayments for your whole life. And then not only your whole life, but even your children continue to pay your debts. This strikes me as a very classic case of rent seeking. landlords more generally who own property and rent it out tend to be kind of more on the rent-seeking side, especially in countries like the UK that don't have particularly strong tenants' rights, particularly strong tenants' unions. Some of you may not know this, but like the majority of inner London, zones 1 and 2, is owned by the Duke of Westminster, who leases it out to people on a kind of 100-year basis, which means that all of that land just kind of belongs to him. He's not really doing anything with it. He just does some administrative paperwork every now and then to get huge amounts of money back from people who are using that land. This is basically rent-seeking behavior, and it's particularly problematic because a lot of existing homeowners, existing landowners, use their power to prevent regulation, to create regulations or enforce regulations that prevent the construction of new property, and thereby they maintain high prices and they maintain their ability to extract rents from especially younger generations. Other examples of rent seeking, I think this is my last slide. So basically anything that seeks to profit off transactions costs specifically. So a recent example is cryptocurrency gas fees. So some of you guys may not know this. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in crypto, but one of the ironies of crypto is that in order to make a transaction, in order to convert currency, especially from crypto into dollars, you have to pay what's called a gas fee, which is the fee for a cryptocurrency exchange to run the blockchain through a transaction. Gas fees can be quite high, like $15. And the irony is that cryptocurrency is often presented as this decentralized way to get power away from the big banks who are just making money off you, presenting the big banks as parasites, which in many ways they are. But cryptocurrency is no different, right? It's not unregulated. There are still transaction fees, and there's still a bunch of people who kind of set up the infrastructure and are now just making money off that infrastructure. A kind of fantasy example of rent seeking is trolls in fantasy who collect a toll for crossing a bridge, but they didn't build the bridge, right? If they built it and then they charged you for the time that they put into building the bridge, that would be fine. If they just take over a bridge and extort money from people who want to cross it, then that's an example of rent seeking. Extortion, generally where you pay people to protect you from you destroying their property, is another example of rent seeking. That's a kind of common behavior from the mafia. Making money without effort is a form of rent seeking. Classic example of this in developing countries especially is that the government will prohibit imports of a particular good and then give one company a license to do that importing. That company usually has political connections. This is a form of corruption, so the government will buy the loyalty of this group by giving them that license, which allows them to charge high prices because they're the only one selling that good into the market, so they have monopoly power, so they can make a whole bunch of money, and then they have loyalty to the government that gives them that. It's exactly how Putin's kleptocracy works in Russia. Another example is pharmaceutical companies, charging $5,000 a month for insulin to diabetics in the US. They're a captured market. The diabetics need insulin to live, so their willingness to pay is very high, but the cost of producing insulin is vastly below $5,000 a month. Another common form of rent-seeking that is quite insidious and might not appear to be rent-seeking initially is bureaucrats who create unnecessary compliance costs and compliance regulation to justify their own existence. So, have you done a risk assessment? Have you done an ethics approval for this incredibly low risk research? We just need to have ethics approval. That's the process. That's the protocol. It has to be done. Really, this is just a way to create a job for someone who doesn't really do anything, right? Obviously, there are cases where you want regulation around risk and ethics. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but oftentimes when you see unnecessary bureaucracy, this is a kind of work for the dole scheme for people who don't have better things to do with their time. An example of this that I'll finish on is the bureaucratic regulation of universities, which is something that's very close to my heart. So the UK government puts us every 5 years or so through this enormous, so costly exercise called the Research Excellence Framework and the Teaching Excellence Framework that I think are completely wasteful. Universities are in one of the world's most competitive industries. The labour market is totally global. Salaries are hyper competitive. Students are international. And basically the market functions really well. The best academics go to the universities where they get paid the most and where they have the most freedom to teach and research the way they want to do it. students go to the universities when they have the best ranking. I had a Chinese student tell me the other day, generally at home, the rule is if you can afford it, you go to the US. If you can't quite afford the US, you go to the UK. And if you can't quite afford the UK, you go to Australia. Generally speaking, the information that's publicly available on the basis of things like Times Higher Education and these private firms that wear the cost of producing rankings is really high quality and very easily accessible to the public. You can just type into the Google Global University Rankings, they'll give you teaching rankings, they'll give you research rankings, they'll give you all sorts of stuff. Right? It's all there. So why does the government need to have this whole extra massive, such a big layer of bureaucracy? Well, it's really just to generate jobs for people in the education ministry. It really has almost no effect on what we would otherwise do with our time. We would still be doing research, we would still be doing teaching, and we'd still be doing it the way we are today. There's really no consequence of that research and teaching evaluation exercise other than to waste a whole bunch of university people's time, regulators' time, and taxpayers' money. Right, I think we're going to finish there. I hope that was an enjoyable bonus lecture, and I'll see you in class.